come on.
This is Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie and Bill. You're listening to LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7, here in Lansing, Michigan, on a cold evening again. Supposedly it's spring, but you wouldn't know it from the weather outside. This evening we are going to be joined by Ingham County Treasurer Eric Schertzing, and he also serves as the head of the land bank, or is involved with the land bank. And we will be talking with him. And Bill has joined us. And greetings, Bill.
Good evening.
Greetings. And we have been talking about looking at some purple dots on the map.
Sounds like LSD. But I don't think
Eric always brings visual aids with him. And here is.
this is a map of Lansing, right, Eric?
Yeah, map of Lansing. It's something I've been sharing with the city and county elected officials. It tells kind of our story of property tax woe. Looking at the 2011 taxes that people haven't been able to pay that are subject to foreclosure at the end of the month. I think I've talked previously. I know it gets people.
It takes 3 years.
Yeah, it's at the end of the third year of taxes kicking in. And, you know, the mortgage foreclosure situation has been improving gradually, fairly significantly for a number of years. But the property tax foreclosure process really plateaued at a high level in 2010, and it's continuing this year, and it looks like it's going to continue at a high level next year.
Do you have any idea why?
Well, it's always a lagging indicator, you know, it's just
it?
because of the collection, you know, cycle that we're in. But, you know, I think it's just symptomatic that there's still a lot of people hurting. You know, there's a lot of people doing fine.
Yeah.
But then there's this substrata that has always struggled, and this Great Recession really just knocked them back on their heels, and they're not recovering. They're not getting the jobs that the economy is creating, or if they do get, those jobs aren't paying enough.
What I know from having been in poverty myself, my first husband contracted cancer, and it threw us in an economic downward spiral. And what I discovered when that happened was that you have to start prioritizing. And one of the things that you will do, of course, is that you will prioritize the house payment, but not necessarily the taxes. Because, you know, 2 or 3 months later, depending on the instrument that you're on, you could be out of your home if you don't pay on your mortgage. But at the same time, if you do not pay your taxes, it takes a while. So once they get behind, what's the problem? They can't catch up either, can they?
Sure, you know, these purple spots that Bill referred to on the map, you know, we started out a year ago with about 2,500 of them. And the great news is 90% of those people will pay.
90%.
90%. So that means we're going to end up with about 250 foreclosures. But the folks here this year are paying, you know, they got like a $350 flat fee that they're paying per parcel, and for over 40% interest. So, you know, you combine the economics and the psychology of it, and for those 90% that pay, why do they want to, they like county government so much that they want to pay us a bonus? I don't think that's it.
I don't think so either.
No, you know, they like me.
When
but
you
not
say
that
$350
much.
a parcel, you're saying that's the penalty for
There's
paying late?
some fees in statute and some processing fees.
But
and
then
stuff.
on top, the total tax bill that you have would be paid at 41% interest?
This month is 41 and a half on all these purple parcels.
Wow, that's astounding.
Oh, it's huge amounts of dollars. And why are those 90% that are going to come up with the money anyway wanting or willingly paying all that extra? It's one of the things that
Yeah, it would be interesting to look at if it's the psychology or if it's a practical matter on how they get their money. But it's got to be a mix.
There's so many of them. I mean, if you're talking 2,500, that's what surprises me. Because for 90% of those people to still be able to come up with the money, but have to pay such a huge penalty.
Well, you know, actually, it's interesting. So in Ingham County, there's about 100,000 parcels.
Okay.
And about 10,000 of them go delinquent. So 90% of the people pay current.
Oh, okay.
And then 10% come over delinquent. And 75% of those delinquents pay up in that first year, where it's, you know, it's expensive but not outrageous. And we end up with this 2,500 at the end, you know, 2.5% of what we started out with. and then 90% of those pay. So
Apparently, we're not teaching math well enough to send.
Are they repeat customers, so to speak?
a lot of them are repeat customers, unfortunately.
So they're
sure.
borrowing money at usury rates, which is
Credit
kind of
credit cards are literally, at least well, even in Michigan, credit cards are a better deal
They
than
max
owing
out
the
at
county
24
treasurer.
to 29, somewhere in that.
Yeah, and by the time you add the fees in to this process,
Yeah.
you get
So
into
can you
those.
pay by credit card?
You can do that over the phone or
Wow.
online, which just
Well,
kind of
I'm-
shifts the burden
Which
over
also,
to the.
I suspect
I'm
some of those
confused.
people are also borrowing money to pay the tax at that point rather than lose the property.
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, I do know. I mean, there's just a lot of things going on in these people's lives, obviously. The concern is that this Great Recession really knocked people back on their heels, and either they're not getting jobs that pay enough, or they're just not getting jobs.
Yeah.
And so those that are hurting, the least among us that we should worry about are just facing peril.
And maybe we should think about changing some of those rules and regs where they pay that 41%. That seems a bit
Yes.
stiff.
It seems a
that's
bit
a
much.
huge
Part of it is they may be putting off going to family, friends to get the money every time.
Embarrassment's part of it.
Yeah, that's what I think would be interesting, is the psychology behind it.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is, we know who they are. So we have ways to reach them. Be a great student project to combine psychology and finance.
And journalism.
And journalism, absolutely, to really delve into it. One of the things we're doing this year, because of the propensity of this to continue, is every Thursday night in May, there's going to be a 2-hour forum where we're going to have social services and counseling agencies, the treasurer's office, legal counsel, neighborhood activists, inviting the whole community.
Oh, that's good.
Not so much to talk about the specific parcels subject to foreclosure, because they will have foreclosed, but we've gotten lemons. How can we turn lemons into lemonade? I mean, what can we best do with those properties now that they've come to us? And maybe pick up some strategies for prevention. Well, we're certainly always open to that.
Well, I think an early warning system is a smart move, because if this goes too far, then there's blight. Your community goes downhill.
Well, sure, this is, Flint and Detroit didn't look any worse than this one day, but they looked like this before the Great Recession hit, and now they're just completely devastated.
Detroit's looking at 70,000 properties that have to come down. How many of these will ultimately, if you foreclose on them, have to come down?
It's been running about a third of the structures that we foreclose on. A third of the properties about need to come down. We've got a couple hundred in inventory right now that we're reevaluating, most of which have to come down. That's one of the reasons we're looking at deconstruction rather than demolition, which could provide some job training and employment, and some old growth forest. That's really
Right.
what sits in our neighborhoods from when these houses were built, and try to put them to better use.
It's a good segue into the other thing you wanted to talk about tonight, which is Money Smart Week. And see, if you get smart about money, then you don't have to worry about these kinds of
Absolutely. And we're even handing out bags of shredded money. Nobody has successfully put it back together again.
It sounds like the
guy in the
I didn't
commercial
say
does with his
bags
little
of money.
daughter.
I said bags of shredded money.
Yeah.
Let's
It
get
sounds
that
like
clear.
the odds that you had on picking the one right
Oh, the brackets.
The
brackets,
Buffett bracket.
yeah.
Yeah.
The first week it was over.
Again this year, the county treasurer and a lot of other nonprofits in the community, working with the Federal Reserve, are part of Money Smart Week, where people can learn, about finance, about extreme couponing, about the tax foreclosure system. They can go to moneysmartweek.com. It's a website. It runs from April 5th through the 12th. And just, take advantage of the opportunities. It's throughout the region, a lot of them in Ingham County. We use the downtown Capillary District Library facility for most of the classes. The Michigan State University has been part of it this year, so there's some classes over there, which is great. Just
Are
keep
they for
growing
the
it.
students to help them with money, or is
Targeted towards students on
excellent.
campus, yeah. So again, moneysmartweek.com, or you can find it on Facebook.
so many of them have school debt that equals far more than I used to for my first home?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's an important issue for them.
So
And
that's a
second
great
homes in
resource.
some cases.
Oh yes, yeah, waterfront home.
Yeah.
And now you on Saturday had this event that I want to know more about, where you've done some really creative things here, I must admit, in the county that I really like. When the deluxe motel was
Not what you
coming
think
in.
of for a county treasurer.
No,
Yeah,
no.
cool.
They're,
Yeah.
they're supposed to be boring.
Yeah, right. But you had the graffiti on the motel, and then this was write your ideas on the wall. How did that work? What was this all about on Saturday?
Well, we call it the Wishing Wall property there at Kalamazoo and Hayford on the east side. And, that was a city nonprofit land bank treasure collaborative to put that wishing wall up. And we collected over 800 things that people wrote on the wall
Really?
over months. And Saturday was really inviting the community in. I mean, we had a few community members, never as many as you'd want, but a few real people showed up. And Vince Delgado from the university led us through a process of kind of sorting out those
Oh.
answers and trying to figure out what they might mean for a vision for that property.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
and,
great.
and so by proxy, everybody that wrote on the wall was represented there on Saturday. And that was, 2.5 hours. We had 20, 25 people there through the course of it, and just came up with some neat, different ideas for how to connect that building back into the fabric of the community, whether it's with agriculture or arts or whatever it might be.
Oh, that's
Yeah, I saw
wonderful.
Joan Allen propose something that has to be related to food.
I would assume.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is a natural,
Right.
and the type of thing I add is just if it can be sustainable, there needs to be a business plan.
Right.
It's great to have another community arts outlet, but then somebody's got to raise the money to sustain it.
There has to be some sort of economic anchor in that.
That's where I'm usually coming from on stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bill and I went over, speaking of writing on the walls, one of the favorite videos I've done was the time that Bill and I went over, and also with Stephanie Glazer from the Poetry Center, and people had written literary references all over the walls of Morrill Hall before it went down. And we were able to capture video of some of that.
Thousands of them.
It was just astounding.
it was-
It's too bad it couldn't have been cataloged.
I wanted to go in there and save one piece of a wall for myself, but the day I wanted to go in, there was the fire. So after that, it was over. They wouldn't let anyone in. I was going to take a Sawzall and cut out Jack Kerouac. It's pretty amazing what was recorded though, because you took a couple hundred photographs. I probably took 150, and then you've got probably an hour of video.
Right.
So, I mean, it's archival.
Yeah.
But it was pretty amazing what students did and the faculty did just on their own one night. They stayed overnight and just graffiti every surface inside, ceilings.
It's fascinating when you can engage a community to come out and actually do these things. That's what I think is so interesting, where people will come out and write on the walls and give ideas that way. I mean, it really does. If you get 25 people at a Saturday afternoon workshop for 2.5 hours, that's quite good.
Especially during basketball season.
Well, that's true.
Well, some of us were the regulars, so it wasn't everybody that was legitimate. But we certainly want to think about where else in the community, in the broad community, I think. We really had no idea how many people would write on it. And I mean,
Right.
it was just overwhelming. In the ice storm, it became an outlet for some frustration in the community.
Really?
And that's great. I mean, we'd much rather have somebody, write something down than punch their fist through a window or something. So if it can be a healthy outlet for the community in good times and in bad, to talk about their future, there's a little anonymity to it. They don't have to risk standing in front of a group of folks to share their ideas. I just think there's a lot of positives. So we need to think about where else should things like this be done. Whether it's the state legislature or the university
You can't carry a sign
or
into the
county
Capitol.
government.
Yeah, I love that. Every time I go in there, it says no signs allowed in Capitol. And I've always wanted to put a little sticky on there that said guns allowed.
Guns allowed, because they did change the law. The
Right.
gun people
Can't
were
take a sign,
there
but you can
celebrating that
take a
when I
gun.
went down there to Gun
There's
Appreciation
something
Day.
fishy in my world about that.
You could
Yes.
have a mobile chalkboard though that
Yeah.
parked in front of the Capitol
Yes, you
where
could.
people could write in what they.
Ooh.
Well, Steve Niebeling's been writing about the graffiti artist in Motor City Muckraker, the graffiti artist in Detroit. And I think graffiti art is interesting in many cases. We're going to be looking at Exit Through the Gift House, my documentary film class about Banksy, the graffiti artist. But graffiti is an interesting thing because it's both blight and art. And what you're giving is a sanctioned place where people can go and do something creative and express themselves. That's kind of a better outlet, isn't it, than just waiting for somebody to grab a
Y-
spray can?
That makes me think of the graffiti art project we did on the old Deluxe Inn
Yeah.
because, a lot of, and I was too, once I thought about it more.
Skeptical?
No, nervous.
Yeah, yeah.
What were we going to unleash?
Right.
And,
Who are they going to take off down the street and do everything else?
and, and that didn't happen,
No.
fortunately, I knock on wood,
Yeah.
for that stuff. But because I tend to see the artistic side of it.
But we all want to leave our mark on the world.
Oh,
you know?
absolutely,
I mean,
absolutely.
and then you tore it down.
And then we painted the pig and we tore
But
it
see,
down.
that's the kind of project you'd see in New York City.
Yeah.
It's ephemeral. They do
Right.
it for 1 week, 2
That's
weeks, a
gorgeous.
month, and it's gone.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
things like that.
I haven't had another comparable building from tax foreclosure, so we're always
Work
looking.
on it.
Mm.
I saw a big one up here.
Well, thank you very much to Eric. It is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. This is Bonnie Bucqueroux and Bill Castanier. And now I would like to introduce our next guest as I move our magic webcam. And this is not as high tech as where I have last seen Dr. Lisa Cook. I saw her on Saturday on the Melissa Harris Perry show. I think the technology was a bit better there. They didn't have a handheld webcam that they moved over to see you. But greetings, so glad to have you here. There's
So glad to be
many
here.
things for us to talk about. Let me move your mic a bit closer,
Okay.
if I might. That'd be great. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is that on that show, one of the issues that was of real interest to me was you were talking about the disparities in women's income and some of the people that fall behind on things like taxes and the single mothers who are struggling in our culture to be able to have enough to raise the next generation. That's a real issue, and that's an issue in so many of our communities. And I appreciate that there are shows like the Melissa Harris Perry show and then the Up with Steve Kornacki show on NBC that provide the time to go into some of these issues in depth, because sometimes we handle these in a kind of
Yes.
slapdash manner.
Sure.
What are some of the things we need to know about the root causes of the kinds of poverty that lead people to fall behind like that?
So, just to give the conversation some context, we were talking about the Ban Bossy campaign that Sheryl Sandberg and the Girl Scouts have initiated in conjunction with Lean In and in conjunction with a research study that was conducted by the Girl Scouts. And they were addressing the issue of confidence. How do we make sure that girls and young women have confidence such that they are not pushed aside in the classroom and in society? So those were the kinds of issues we were talking about, the kinds of data that I was citing. So we were looking at the outcome, so the input, calling young girls bossy, and then they shrink from leadership positions. And what you get is a whole host of outcomes, from bad grades to not showing up in leadership positions, and probably teenage pregnancy and so on. Although we didn't get too much into poverty, we did get into income inequality. So what I was saying was that you have 76% or so of low-wage earners in the U.S. are women, and women over the age of 34, median age 34, not starter jobs. These are mainly in the fast food industry. These are not starter jobs. These are not the jobs of a decade ago or even a generation ago where you did have these starter jobs. People are getting stuck in these jobs, and most of them have at least some college education.
Yes.
We didn't think of this as a destination for our college-educated students, our college-educated graduates. So there's been a real shift. And most of the workforce that is at that level is made up of women. So you get this disparity in the distribution of high-income positions that are mainly dominated by men, and then low-income positions that are mainly dominated by women. So that's where the inequality comes from. Now, many times the administration and others quote, for every dollar a man receives, 77 cents is received by a woman. Now that's kind of true, but it's mainly in this distribution, this unequal distribution, that you get that skewness. So depending on the job, there's some jobs where men and women get equal pay, and a lot of the CEOs at Fortune 500 companies who are men and women get paid equally.
Right.
But there's so few women in there. I mean, the
Right.
concentration is at the lower end.
We still see disparities even in the same jobs on occasion, and it's not unheard of that
Absolutely,
women
absolutely.
that face those problems.
Right, right, right.
Then we've seen the conversation become a little more nuanced nowadays, talking about whether things like Stanford's Lean In would help with women with their negotiating. That part of the
Mhm.
challenge is that women are traditionally raised to be more deferential to authority than
Right.
not be as quick to ask for the money. I know
Right.
Mika Brzezinski on that channel has written a book and makes quite an argument that that was part of her failure to ask for the money that she was actually worth and be
Mhm.
willing to leave if she didn't get it, and that many
Right.
women are
Right.
unwilling to do that.
Right.
But it still seems to me that there is this sort of structural problem too, where it's our expectations in the jobs that we go into. Women are
Mhm.
more likely to go into jobs in the helping professions, for example,
Mm.
and those have been undervalued. Yet we've seen fields. I watched it happen to public relations. Many of my former journalism colleagues went into public relations.
Mhm.
And the more and more women moved into public relations, we saw wages stay depressed as opposed to
Mhm.
rising. So there is that sort of pink collar effect that takes place also when the
Right,
field
right. I
becomes.
mean, women were quite evident in two fields where we don't see them anymore. The chair of the Berkeley Economics Department in the 1910s was a woman.
What?
Yes, yes, she was the first and the last.
Oh.
That's when um, women were sort of how should I put this? They were lopped off and put in social work. There were schools of social work that were created so that they would have a place to be, even though their research, their interests, their teaching interests may have been similar to men's.
Ah.
So you don't see women, you see a lot more women, much more active during that period as researchers, as professors, as teachers, and then they completely disappear. The same is true for coding. I mean, women used to be the ones who did all the computer science, all the statistics, and all the computer science. And now you can't find them among the PhDs who
Oh,
are
that's
given
interesting.
every year, or among the undergraduates who are turned out every year. I mean, things flip like that. I mean, it's not too unusual, and this happens in a number of different professions. This has happened in a number of professions.
Bonnie, one of the things I remember when I was at MSU, I remember the first woman being accepted in the veterinary program. This was probably in '69, around in that.
Mhm.
Now it's almost 100% women. But
Really?
in that case, the
Hmm.
wages are depressed for those occupations.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if it's because there's too many vets for the society, but
There's a lot of reasons why.
but there's a lot of reasons, but that's how that totally flipped. And that kind of
Mhm.
surprises me.
One of the other things I've been curious about is it seems to me that among my female friends, I see a greater aversion to what I would call corporate values in favor of human values.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that if I look at the last few decades in the culture, Douglas Rushkoff wrote the book Life Inc., talking about how too much of our life is now judged on corporate values and not
Hmm.
human values.
Okay.
And we've moved into, and that, as an economist, I would argue that, why has that happened? And isn't that part of why I think women are quicker to maybe to reject some of those corporate values? We're more focused on the idea that in the helping professions that we do want to help the next generation. We may not want to just go for the top dollar. We may not see success in terms of working 80-hour weeks as a CEO. Having time for family may be more of a value that we have generally. I mean, you can't argue that all women are, that we're certainly not monolithic, but is that part of the economic calculus of the wage disparity?
So I think it's part of it. I mean, I think that I was just in Silicon Valley talking to some friends and colleagues who are at tech firms who lead design teams, and this is where you see a lot of the disparity in income and
Yes.
and wages and activity, and then longevity in those positions. So I was asking them, so how many women have you had on your design team and so on? And these are friends, so
Yeah.
I'm not talking in a hostile way or an accusatory way. But one thing they said was that you get rewarded for your output, and a direct input for your output is time seen in the workplace, time seen, and we see this from Marissa Meyer. I mean, the whole upheaval
Yes.
about her calling people back into work. As if flex time were the ultimate in productivity, and she found that it wasn't, and she asked people to come back to work.
And she hands off the new baby to the au pair.
Well, no, she had the nursery bills right next to her office to augment. Yeah.
Everyone.
So that's one way that we actually do need to help women stay in the workforce is to have these nurseries on site. I mean, that's a good way to do it. My sense is that Yahoo already had on site childcare. I think, but certainly not the new nursery that's right next door. But in any case, I think that it is striking to know that in engineering generally and at these tech firms, it's how many hours you put in, just as if you were a graduate student. So the question is if you can change your corporate model and the very masculine atmosphere to make it okay for there to be off ramping for a couple of years and then on ramping again, or some work being shifted to home, or there not being a penalty for women to do this, and not being a penalty for men to do it too, so that they can take paternity leave without feeling embarrassed or feeling as though they're going to miss out on their careers. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So sometimes it's women thinking that they cannot have these careers. Sometimes it's the wage structure that says you can't have these careers, and the incentive structure that also says that you can't have these careers. And when you're gone, you're forgotten. Even though the Family Leave Act is in place, your job is guaranteed. It doesn't say that you will, you'll be with your cohort, you won't get the raises, and so on. So there's a lot to be done.
I know on some of the incubator places out on the West Coast, for example, it's not unusual to have the office cat or the office dog, but you would not be able to have the office baby. It wouldn't be as comfortable for the woman to bring in the baby and breastfeed.
Sure.
And part of that too, I think, is sort of there is a frat boy culture at some of those places that may be off-putting to women. It may be a self-fulfilling prophecy where you don't apply because you don't feel comfortable.
Right. Part of it too, this is just working in my mind. I was the first state employee to have paternity leave.
Were you?
Yeah. And it was sort of not by my bosses, but by other people I worked with was frowned upon.
Shaming, yeah.
I didn't care.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of confidence about it. But that 10 years later could not have been done in state government because it was done away with. There's a political overlay on some of these things. I think our politics nationally create sort of an atmosphere of what works and what doesn't work also.
So that right was taken away?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's discouraging.
In the way I took it, absolutely. Yeah.
Huh? Well, so intriguing.
Well, and even in the university setting, I have had a number of male colleagues say, well, you guys get an unfair advantage because you get maternity leave and you're able to get more work done and so on. So your tenure clock is advantaged by you're taking maternity leave. And, it's the most, and it's not, this isn't funny. This isn't, it's not like they're kidding. There's no humor. They completely believe it.
Yeah.
And they will use paternity leave to try to get a leg up on the women who are getting maternity leave.
Wow. That's interesting. I've never heard that. That's kind of a fascinating look at life.
Yeah.
I think it's quite common at research universities and certainly in economics departments. I think it's fairly widespread. I think that thinking is fairly widespread, which is why you don't see very many women who are married in departments, and you certainly don't see many with children.
And I bet if you looked at the demographics and tied it back to people pursuing an advanced degree, they waited until later to have children. You see that in East Lansing. You see it in Ann Arbor.
Oh, sure.
Everybody's older.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like in their 40s and they have their first kid.
Absolutely.
That's interesting.
Sure.
But
Sure.
I can understand a little bit of it.
Sure. And there's a lot of adoption here too, to just,
That's true.
to sidestep the biological clock altogether.
Wow.
And in college towns, that's what you find.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Lisa Cook, and I'd like to shift gears now because one of my real passions, as I was talking about with that Rushkoff book, is this idea about corporate values infecting the rest of our life. And I know that Kalle Lawson, who was one of the instigators, he does Adbusters and he does culture jamming, and he was one of the originators of the Occupy movement.
Mhm.
And he is calling for a sort of revolution in economics, that we need an economics that begins to embrace and include the external costs that we so often see in our processes nowadays. We're on the brink of signing TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is sort of the, as somebody said, it's NAFTA on steroids for the Asian sphere. And the challenge, as Ralph Nader once argued with these treaties, is being able to include the real costs of environmental damage and labor problems. Are we any further along in that discussion, or what is going to happen with something like TPP? Are we going to see this acceleration of manufacturing jobs going into all the low-wage countries?
Well, I think we are much farther along than we were, say, when NAFTA was being debated with respect to incorporating the real cost, the opportunity cost, so economists would call it, of depleting natural resources. So in terms of the environment, I think we're getting closer. And there are a lot of hidden things in GDP that we are incorporating more into our calculations. And to tell you the truth, the Great Recession laid bare some of the less than perfect calculations that we were doing with respect to GDP. So I think that we're still trying to figure out what kind of damage was done, but we're also trying to think about the changing structure of it and how one might incorporate these opportunity costs. So I think there has been a lot of movement with respect to the literature. But I'm not so sure there has been as much movement in the sphere of public policy. So we don't yet have markets for carbon emissions. So New England states do. We have them on the state level. We don't have this on the national level yet, and it's not widespread. Some states here and there do, and the New England region does. But this is just a very small group of states, and there should be more. There should be more of them. So I really think that that there hasn't been this seepage that you would imagine yet in the realm of public policy.
Isn't pricing carbon, though, at this point almost, I worry about that strategy. I was one of the 1,000 people that went down and took the training from Al Gore personally back in 1999. And I've been very worried about carbon markets because I think a market-based solution is very appealing because it would seem to have bipartisan consensus. But a lot of the literature I've looked at has suggested that it really hasn't been terribly effective in the places that it has been tried in really reducing carbon emissions, that there are so many ways around it. I have a friend who, every time she travels for the university, she has a tree planted in the rainforest.
Right.
The only challenge is when you go to look for the tree, you find out that they're pulling it up every year and planting a new one because that's cheaper. I mean, there are so many ways around it, and it's so hard to hold it accountable. Is that sufficient to the challenge of the task that we face in reducing emissions?
So I would say that efforts like that are those are gimmicks.
Yeah, they are.
No, those are gimmicks, and I think that the more serious attempts, like the regional carbon emissions market in New England, is something that is a model. And I think that I haven't seen the research to suggest yet that this is not worth trying. But most of these markets have been in place for a very short period of time, so we can't make any causal statements about sort of depletion and minimizing emissions. But the big conversation that has not yet happened in this country, but was the subject of the first essay that I ever wrote for a prize and won for a prize, conservation. We are not yet talking about conservation, and there's just so much more we could do. Or we're not having a broad general debate, broad general discussion about conservation, and that's what we should be doing. Because that's what's going to, in my view, that's what's going to make the biggest difference. All of these other things are marginal. You add things here. Of course, you learn to trade with some countries, and then if you can't get the permits that you want, then you change something else. Yes, there are ways around it. But if actual people can think about conservation as a serious strategy, I think that's where the big gains would come from.
I was amused to see that we're urging the Ukrainians, we're going to go in and try to help them in order to solve their energy problems, give them the vulnerabilities that they have now.
Mhm.
That in the remaining part of Ukraine where we have our authority, we're going to go in and urge them to embrace conservation, which is, they were talking about how we could cut energy use there 20%. We could, of course, do the same thing here.
Right, 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 right. But we've got nuclear weapons and we're not on Russia's border.
So I'm not
So
sure.
there's not a dire disaster that is imminent. We were doing it, I think. I mean, I wasn't alive then, but I think we were doing this during the period of the Cold War. I think we were doing this during World War II. I think we were doing it during World War One. You know, when there was a national emergency, we were doing it.
Yes.
But we're not doing it now because there is none.
I'm old enough to remember rationing. You know,
Okay, okay.
I mean, and when it was government imposed, you had
Right,
to.
right.
You conserved energy by just, if you didn't have a ration card, you couldn't get any gas, so you couldn't go anywhere.
Right, right. So I've heard my parents talk about this. Yes.
What do you
yeah.
think we should conserve? I mean, where do you
Well,
think we
that's-
should put our sort of efforts in this country? What?
Wow.
So you're gonna get me in trouble.
No.
My students laughed at me because my main mode of transportation generally is a bicycle. So when I can use it, I do, or use my legs. But I actually like the exercise, the independence of a bicycle. So I use it, whenever I can, as much as I can. So that's one way. And people, we all do this, even though we love cars more than anything in Michigan. People still drive from one store in the shopping mall to another store. And come
Walk.
on,
Yeah.
just walk. That will be helpful. There will be other externalities, other spillovers from just walking rather than taking your car. So I think that there are simple things that everybody can do. And again, that's where I think we would get the biggest gains. I'm not saying, ditch all of our cars. Not at all. I'm saying do something. Everybody can do something. You remember in the 70s, we were turning off light switches.
Wearing
We were wearing sweaters.
Jimmy Carter included.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what my essay was about, and that's the one that won. So, what kids can do.
He started the informal workplace almost.
He did.
So you could wear a sweater to work rather
My
than a
challenge
sport
with
coat.
that has always been that I think, again, because of my concern about corporate values versus human values, the corporations are always quick to say, oh, let's look over here at your behavior and we'll change your behavior, but we won't change ours. Yet if you look at I show some of my classes, I do a class on sustainability, and I show them the story of stuff done by Annie Leonard of supported by the Tides Foundation, which is admittedly a nice lefty foundation. And she talks about the fact that for every pound of waste that we're throwing out at the curb, there are 70 pounds upstream of whatever it has taken to produce that. And if we only that is something we can control, but I no longer think it's sufficient to the challenge. I was watching Vice on Shane Smith of Vice, that's the new website, and they have a show on HBO, and he was visiting Greenland, and on Friday night, they were sitting out there at a campfire in Greenland in the wilderness and listening to the calving of the icebergs as the icebergs are falling apart. And it's happening at such a rate beyond what we had ever anticipated.
Right.
And the person that he was talking to, the scientist that he was talking to, said we have to cut our rate immediately by 80% of our fossil fuels in order to stave off utter disaster. That seems to me an impossible amount. I mean, I can't foresee that it could happen even if you had a dictator in place who said that we had to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that would be unrealistic over a short period of time.
Right.
Over a longer period of time, I would imagine that it would be achievable. But I think that there are different tasks for different sectors of the economy.
Okay.
So for corporate entities, so I was thinking about I'm always thinking about first, if there's a public policy problem, I'm thinking about what I can do first.
Oh.
Yeah. So I recorded or listened to the recordings of JFK for every student government election I was ever in, and I repeated it. So that's the first way I think. So what can I do? But if we're talking about public policy, I think one of the things that corporations could do is to do what corporations like Sherwin-Williams did. I covered Sherwin-Williams when I was at Solomon Brothers, and they came up with this wastewater treatment such that they wouldn't waste as much water. It's sort of 80% less water use. I think it was. They were learning how to apply spray paints to cars that you that require roughly 20% of the energy that regular spray paints would. So I think that the technology can help us with all of this. That's
Okay.
why I'm saying 80% could be achievable, but I don't think that's true in the short run. I think it could be true in the long run. So I think corporations have a role to play, and they're taking the lead sometimes. Yeah, maybe they need a nudge from activists, from the legislatures, but otherwise, I think that technology can add a lot where conservation may not be able to move things as quickly. But it's going to take a lot of things done by a number of different sectors.
My concern is that sometimes it seems to me politically it's easier to try to game the system than to make the change. And
Oh yeah, it always is. I mean, that's Russia's problem.
yes, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
the
yeah,
corruption
yeah, yeah.
and the kleptocracy that
Yeah,
makes the
and it's
difference.
high gas prices,
Yes.
high energy prices. I mean, they didn't restructure after the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't need to. The oil prices were high enough, and they could subsidize all the other segments of the economy. But that's an analogy. I understand. But yes, you can always game the system. But what I'm suggesting is that when things get bad enough in your neighborhood, you stop thinking, I think, or you at least start thinking more carefully about gaming the system and its overall effects on everybody.
Right. I think of the example, I was once on a tour with a group of farmers who were being taken down to Detroit Edison, and Irv Raven, the late Irv Raven from Detroit Edison, was on our bus and explaining at the Monroe coal plant, which is a facility that absolutely astounds you if you watch it, as the huge coal cars come in on the trains and get dumped right into the plant literally as they consume coal there. And he was talking about the fact that when the EPA first passed regulations monitoring the emissions at the stack, that part of the challenge was that at the agency level, after the legislation had passed, that's where the real devil in the details takes place. And that what they were arguing over was how far away would you place the monitors? And of course, the environmentalists wanted them at the top of the stack. And the corporations were ultimately able to make a reasonable sounding argument that you should place them about a mile away. What really people hadn't realized, and which he explained, and I thought it was odd, he was ratting out his own folks, was that he was saying what the companies found was that it was cheaper to build the stacks taller than it was to get rid of the sulfur, because it meant that they could spew it out at a further distance so it didn't hit the monitor a mile away. What it did, however, was cause acid rain in Canada. So see, the problem is sometimes it isn't your backyard that gets hit, it's Canada. So then Canada had to raise quite a fuss and force American power companies to stop that little practice.
Right, sure. So that's where I would argue for economic interdependence, because we can't live without Canada. I mean, it's our largest. Even if we cut it off and sort of dumped it into the sea, we couldn't live without it. It's our largest exporter importer. I mean, it's one of the richest countries. We get all of our medicine from there. It's subsidized there. We use it.
But they get it much cheaper than we do. If we went over
but that's why we have to import it. We're not investing the way they are. Or there are intellectual property issues, for example, that differ between the two countries. But there has to be somebody on the other side of the transaction. That's what I'm saying. Somebody who was willing to raise his or her or its voice to say that this is impossible. We can't live this way. We won't build your bridge if you don't if you don't behave properly. We'll yank all of our funding, and you need that bridge just like we do. So there has to be somebody else on the other side of that transaction.
Can we have a sustainable society where 1% of the population earns 20% of the income and holds on to 40% of the wealth? Can you take that much money off the table?
I would say that there's the economic literature shows that these economies are typically unstable. So you say unsustainable, I say unstable, and there is revolution. Yeah, I think so. I think if we think about Tsarist Russia, there's tremendous income disparity, and they tried tweaking the laws with respect to serfdom. Giving serfs all kinds of power. Serfs could own other serfs. They could create factories. You had to get rid of the system of serfdom. I mean, really. I mean, it wasn't going to change that much. And then you had to have. I mean, it seemed that even just getting rid of it wasn't getting rid of the social mores, for example, that were consistent with serfdom.
Right.
So you needed a real revolution. Now that's we don't want it's sort of a big we don't want big social upheaval. So
That's a
what
bad
you
way to
want
make
to
change.
do, yeah, exactly. What you want to do is to prevent some sort of big social upheaval and think about ways like raising the minimum wage or doing other things that might make for a more equitable distribution of income.
I
I
was
haven't thought of the word serf, but I think more and more people are feeling like serfs to
wage
I,
service.
I think so. Yeah.
to handfuls of people.
Right. Oh yeah.
Kind of
Oh
a
yeah.
bizarre feeling.
Yeah, yeah, and tethered to the land in a certain way, or tethered to their jobs. Many of them because of healthcare. I mean,
Yeah.
the healthcare, the ACA is going to change that, but still, people feel if you talk to these low-income workers who are protesting ever so often, they feel chained to their jobs, and they certainly feel chained to their destinies in low-wage jobs, and that's a real hard thing to accept in a country as rich as ours, as educated as ours, and as advanced as ours.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7. Here in Lansing, Michigan, we're talking with Dr. Lisa Cook from Michigan State University about the overall economy. One of the points I would like to make, in addition to the equal pay, but the minimum wage laws, is that I'm astounded at the level of wage theft that goes on among low wage workers, where they're not paid for overtime. They're required to buy uniforms out of their own money. They're forced to come in for training that's unpaid. The kinds of things that there are laws on the books saying you can't do that, but even large corporations, McDonald's was just caught for doing large amount. I mean, that's to me, and I guess I'd be really remiss if I didn't talk to you about what's happening in Russia, because I've heard you talking about that on the MHP show, Nerdland Plus, and I would be remiss. Today we see that we are no longer looking at the President Obama and the ministers meeting over there in Europe have decided to get rid of Russia, and basically that means the group is no longer functioning as it did. Where are we with this? With the massive buildup of troops, is it getting more tense, less tense? What things should we be looking for to understand that situation?
So I think it's certainly getting more tense militarily and faster. We've noticed that the U.S. has picked up these troop movements. They're massing on the border with eastern Ukraine. So that is certainly cause for worry. Now, at the same time, Russia has more to lose than any other country that is involved.
Their economy is really taking a hit for
Yeah,
this.
it is. It is. So the MISEX stock index has been, the Russian stock market has been down almost 15%.
Wow.
Since the beginning of the year. It is, and most emerging market stocks have been down maybe about 5%, 3 to 5%. So that's a big difference from other emerging markets. Capital flight is roughly about $70 billion, and it was just $60 billion for all of 2013. So they've got the most to lose, and they're forecasting recession. So, stack this on top of a recession. So stack, on top of this, now this is what I really worry about. Putin is unleashing all of these neo-Nazis and deploying them in these various places.
Absolute thugs.
And absolute thugs. And there's a recessionary environment. They can't find jobs. So what happens? That's just the most dangerous mix. That's what they should be very worried about. And when you let the cap off, those kinds of tendencies, something that the Soviet Union tried to manage at all costs, ethnic strife, dissent that had to do with nationalism and neo-Nazism. If you don't manage that, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. It's extremely hard to do.
I saw the Greeks really clamp down on Golden Dawn.
Oh yeah.
They realized you cannot let this happen.
You saw it in Yugoslavia. You see it in a number of different places. Well, you saw it in Germany. I mean, and that's the ever-present thought that the whole reason for the Eurozone existing is because you want to give everybody a stake such that they feel as though their future is intertwined. The future of these countries is intertwined. So yeah, I think this is a really, really bad development, and I think this is something that we should watch as closely as we're watching the economy and as close as we're watching military movements.
What's it mean for American companies doing business in Russia in a big way, like GM? How worried should they be? I mean, they've got to be real concerned about something going south there.
Yeah, but they're always worried about that.
Okay.
You know, and GM would be worried for several reasons. First, it's not a big market. It
Oh,
absolutely isn't a big market for any American company. It's not a big market. Maybe for Pepsi, but it's not really. Russia is, it's a country that has a tenth the size of our economy, if that. So in that sense, we're not too worried. But GM has to worry because Russia has a lot of ties with the Eurozone. And when the Russian economy stabilizes and takes off at some point in the future, GM wants to be there, right? But that's not happening now. And if they're forecasting recession, then it's not going to happen in the near future. It's not going to happen in the next year. But they want to have the foot in the door when it actually happens. GM would worry secondarily about intellectual property. So actually, coming up with new products there or having their design shipped there to be made into products and sold there. But they can't do that because they have very weak intellectual property protection or very weak property protection, period. Who cares about intellectual property? So that's going to be a big concern for GM. It's going to be a big concern for most multinational corporations.
the challenge when the Russian economy takes a hit in the interdependence with Europe is that we've watched how much Europe affects our economy as well. I mean, we are globally interdependent now. So it's
Yeah.
very hard to have economic sanctions against a country that matters,
Yeah.
unless it's a tiny country, without having it, in essence, blow back on us, isn't it, at a certain point? I mean, it's
Yeah.
sort of a round robin, so it's a very careful calibration.
It is. It is. So I would argue that what Russia does and what we can do in retaliation will be constrained by our intertwining economic relations. So Germany can't afford to do very much because it gets one third of its energy from Russia. The same is true for Italy. Poland and some other countries are very dependent on Russia for energy. France is very dependent on defense contracts with the Russian government. So there's something, everybody has some tie. So it's not a big economy, but in certain sectors, it is very important.
Well, this idea that we've gone from facing the constraints of peak oil to all of a sudden becoming an oil boom economy or fossil fuel boom economy and should be licensing, supporting Europe by saying that we will be exporting our natural gas there. First of all, there's logistical problems to doing that are enormous. We'd be talking about huge tankers of LNG, which are not terribly stable. But isn't it the goal to get off of fossil fuels? I mean, one of the challenges is when growth is held as the marker of success, and growth, regardless of how you achieve it, is held as a marker of success. It becomes so easy to go back to the fossil fuel-based economy and say, well, then let's drill, baby, drill, and dig out that coal and do whatever it takes in order to flood the market with cheap energy because that's been the source of our wealth.
Yeah, well, I would hope that no one is thinking about growth any way we get it. That's a very, we learned some bad lessons. We learned some good and bad lessons about growth any way you can get it. So the Tsarist government got it any way it could get it through serfdom. It ultimately was not profitable. We got it through slavery. I mean, there are limits, and we need to think about sustainability. We need to think about the good way to get growth, and not to mention, I'm not sure that it's really realistic for us to think about shipping in the short run, shipping our excess capacity to countries in Europe, mainly because Norway's right there.
Mm.
I mean, and there are other places for them to get oil and get it quickly, or get gas and get it quickly. And I think we would be way behind in that game. And Norway has this big, wealth fund that will keep everybody rich in Norway for generations and generations to come, and keep them educated for generations and generations to come. If they would like to increase capacity at the drop of the hat, they could. And because they love infrastructure, they love infrastructure. We don't like infrastructure. They love infrastructure. So it's going to be very easy for them to ratchet up their production. And they've already got they're close to markets. So I think we would be very late to the game.
Honey, can we circle back just a little bit to the Girl Scout study and the B word? what was their recommendations to create a society of young women who fit that mold better? I mean, that must be in their mind that the Girl Scouts is one answer that we can create strong women. Is that, do they have ideas?
They did and they didn't. I mean, some criticize this as being a PR move. So that's because there weren't that many recommendations besides ban Fosse. But I think it's a powerful one. So the example that I was giving was that I find that in the classes, so most of the classes I teach are economics. They're quantitatively based. There are very few women in these courses, and it's not because there aren't enough women in the student population to take these courses. So this is at Harvard, this is at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Michigan State. There are women to take these courses, but when they show up in the classes, they don't say anything. And they feel intimidated by the guys. So what I do is I call on everybody randomly. So if you come in my class, you've got to talk. So you don't get the opportunity to just sit there. So guys have to be restrained. You can raise your hand, but you're not going to get called on. Not if you're raising it all the time. But everybody gets called on, and every sixth person or something like that. It's random, but it's regular. So the first time I did this, I was called mean and intimidating. I don't want to talk. Now this is again, this is undergraduates and graduates at Harvard, and this is at the Kennedy School of Government, for goodness sake. And I told them, if you shut down your voice now, nobody's ever going to listen to you. You're at the pinnacle of higher education. Nobody's ever going to listen to you. And I tell my students at Michigan State the same thing. If you self-censor now, who on earth is going to listen to you in the future? So what I found is that over time, women come in my class prepared, confident, and they talk and they shut the guys down. And it's really funny to watch. And I don't get the same teaching evaluations that I did before. Professor Cook is mean and bossy and intimidating. And it makes for a really rich class discussion. And it's not that men and women are interested in different things. It's just that they bring a diversity of experiences no matter where they're from and no matter how they've engaged. And they're going to be more than half the workforce. So they better be talking in courses that are related to economics.
I put out the question on Facebook and asked my friends on Facebook what questions I should ask you. And Patrick Deal said he wants to know, what would you say to young women who want to follow in your professional footsteps?
I would say, and I was telling a group this on Friday, there are two things I would say. First, growing up in a small town is a great thing because people don't necessarily have expectations of what you should be doing. So if a woman does it, it's fine. If a man does it, it's fine. Somebody gets it done. Because there's so many jobs. The undertaker is the judge, is the preacher, is the parking lot attendant.
Yeah,
right? So people are resourceful and they don't think about what they should be doing. There's no fixed caste into which they are molded. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just allow, this is what my parents did, they just allowed us to do whatever we were interested in. They were supportive. They gave us some guidance, but otherwise they had no expectations of what we would be. They wanted us to do the best we could do and be the best that we could be. And I think just having supportive parents and, in that sense, a supportive community in a small town made all the difference in the world. I also had a lot of women. I'm just reflecting on this now. In a college town, I had all women except for one man as science and math instructors.
Really?
Yeah. So I don't think about and in my family, women have the math gene. I have an aunt who was the chair of the math department at Virginia State University for my entire adult life. Right. So I think that's another reason why small towns and college towns are good places to raise girl children.
I think they are. Well, one last quick question, and he also wanted to know what is the best thing about being affiliated with MSU?
What's the best thing about being affiliated with MSU? Okay, so there's a tie. Um, the dairy store.
That's good. I'll go to the dairy store
That's it,
anytime.
and I take all of our guests coming from wherever, from Azerbaijan or
Yeah.
from Boston there. But the other thing is just the great supportive community. Now, you could say that that is around football, it's around basketball.
Yeah.
I don't mind it. It's around a number of different things. But President Simon talks about Team MSU all the time, and she really means it. And I think that people are really impassioned by that vision and that thinking. And I think that thinking preceded her. She gave it a name, she gave it a focus. But I think that Team MSU is just really amazing.
Oh, that's great to hear. Well, thank you
Mhm.
so much. This is Lansing Online News Radio. We're signing off. This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. Come back next Monday night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.